The Eddie Adams experience helped me progress as a photographer. I've grown so much since that year. And Eddie Adams isn't about being super diverse all the time. It's sometimes about figuring out what you really want to shoot and what is your specialty, what it is that really makes you tick.
You wouldn't think, but for Eddie Adams, but the guy sitting next to me on the bus on the way out there just had this beautiful book of fashion portraits. And you wouldn't think that in a documentary workshop like Eddie Adams would be interested in seeing a book of fashion portraits.
I first heard about Eddie Adams through Brooks Institute. Our school is pretty heavy on doing internships and finding workshops.
I first heard about the Eddie Adams workshop from another alum. He worked for the Arizona Republic, and at the time he told me if you really want to be serious about photojournalism, you got to get into Eddie.
It was City College of San Francisco. It was a documentary class with Ken Light.
I first heard about the Eddie Adams workshop through Al Bello. He was telling me about workshops, about 3 in particular, that I should apply for. And out of those 3, I asked him which one of those would be the absolute best one, that you have to go to. He said, without questions, hands down, the Eddie Adams workshop.
Eddie Adams workshop I was told about by Lauren Steele at Getty Reportage. I've always been doing some commercial work and then using that money and fueling some documentary work with it. She said you gotta check out the Eddie Adams workshop. It had just closed the applications for that year. I think that might have been 2009. I had to wait until 2010 to apply. And then I didn't get in 2010. And I applied again in 2011, and I got in 2011. So it was like 3 years of waiting. It was a hit when I didn't get in the first time. I was pretty bummed, but I think it just kind of made me work harder, go back to the drawing board, and really consider the portfolio.
I held off applying for a little bit to the workshop because I was just a little intimidated, but when I felt my work was confident, I sent it in, and on my first try I got in. But it was after holding off for about 2-3 years.
To apply into Eddie Adams, I applied twice.
So I applied 5 times before I was accepted. It was a long process. It was a 5-year process in which I went from not care as much because I didn't know what it is going to be about, to being a little disappointed, to being frustrated, to being angry, and not wanting to apply anymore. And then the last time I finally got in.
When I first applied to Eddie Adams, the portfolio I submitted was work from my first year at Brooks. So the first body of work was pretty random, and the second body of work was cohesive and told a story within itself.
I would say the first portfolio I put together for Eddie Adams was very scattered. Had a lot of different images that were, I thought, great single images, but didn't really tell a story and didn't really have a singular voice. And the portfolio that I put together the second time, which was the application that I got in on, was, I think, much more cohesive and had images, even though they were from different stories. I think they really spoke with one voice. Yeah, I guess I would just really encourage people to try to say one thing, have one story, be really cohesive, and not try to show that they can do a lot of different things.
In terms of portfolio, I think it's always important to show your best work and the work that, for me, is my most personal work. Work that really gets me going, getting up every morning and wanting to make more pictures. And this is the work that I did on my grandfather, and some work that I've done in New York City's Chinatown, making portraits of people in the neighborhood. And so these are the things that was most personal to me, and I felt strongly about. I started off just with one of the more provocative images, was something really strong, and the first one's just him smoking a cigarette, but it was just, for me, I call this image the Marlboro Cowboy, because he looks like the iconic images from the 90s. The first image I wanted to make an impact. I wanted whoever was looking at it to go, wow, I want to see more. It was very important that the first one gave you a little shock and gave you something that you really wanted to see. And then I moved on to a diptych of my grandfather and his feet, and that made that was just showing my attention to detail and attention to intimacy, and what I felt brought the viewer closer to a man that they just saw outside and bring him in. And then I moved on to the image of my grandfather's shirt on his chair. Sometimes the best portraits are the portraits without people in them. this for me represents my grandfather so much more than some of my other photos. And then moved on to an image of my grandfather looking directly at me, because so far I hadn't given an image of somebody looking directly at you. So the image of my grandfather walking down the stairs, the composition was what made the photo for me. The next couple of images is just more detail, and then more my ability to show, to compose within a difficult area. The next group is just photos of people of an older age in Chinatown, New York, that I made, and these are photos that showed off my color abilities, my ability to operate in color, and my ability to still tell the story intimately while also working with subjects other than my first part of the portfolio. And then I showed more documentary work with 2 football images. They were my strongest images that from a football series. It also showed that I had diversity, because so far in my portfolio I've only had Asian Americans. So it showed that I can work outside of my community while also creating really beautiful work. And then the last group is just new work that I was working on at the time, where I was photographing kids at a handball court in New York City, and it was just more getting to know them and creating more bodies of work with color, and because that's the direction I was headed, and I really wanted to make work in color. So that's the portfolio I submitted to get into Eddie Adams Workshop number 24.
It's so important that you put in pictures that you stand behind, that you think are your best work. What I did, I think, wrong to some degree, you know, let alone that my work was not strong enough. I let a lot of people to basically give me advice and tell me what to put in there, what not to put in there, what is good, what is not. And I let that opinion to basically rule my portfolio that I was submitting. The main difference about the portfolio that got me in was that I built it based on my own intuition of what I should put there. I still took advice. I spoke to people who looked through it, who looked at what I was considering to submitting. But then I made the final call for the first time when I was applying. So I submitted 2 stories and 1 portrait series. I would say not complete, because you don't have the space for it, but just like a taste from each. The first series I did, it's the shipyards in Bangladesh, the shipbreaking yards. And I open up with an image that I believe till today is probably the strongest image I've ever taken, actually. Even though a lot of people discouraged me submitting that shipbreaking story because a lot of amazing photographers shot it, and obviously they've done it better than me. But this time I decided to go with it, and since I believe that that image is the strongest I've ever taken, I just put it there, I open up with it, and off I go. I knew I don't have the space to show it as a story. I also don't have it as a story. When I photographed it, it was more of a report than an in-depth, intimate story. So I put in the pictures I thought were the strongest, but also not repetitive. I was trying to show different things in each image, still to carry the message of the story across in those limited images I used. The next story, it was actually a story I just did before I submitted it, maybe 2 months before, so it was my fresh work at the time, and usually it's the case that once you shoot something new, you kind of think that that's the strongest you have at the time, and for me that was the most recent thing I just finished back home in the Czech Republic, and it really showed something I love to photograph. It shows culture, it shows intimacy, relationships between people, atmosphere. I love photographing atmosphere. I felt like that really shows what my photography is about, more than anything, because that's what I love to do. I felt it must be part of my portfolio, because this is what I do, and if you like it and you accept me based on that, I belong to the workshop, because that's what I'm about. I believe that the end with the portraits, even though they were different style, they were black and white, completely unrelated to the previous 2 stories I submitted, I felt it was a strong way to end it, because it was different, maybe surprising, after seeing 2 of my stories that have nothing to do with the portraits. But as I was mentioning, since there was good response from some editors who seen those portraits, I believe that that I'm ending the portfolio strong.
What I decided to do was I kind of knock out a lot of my work, and I just focused it on what I absolutely love doing, which is sports, primarily focused on portraiture. In the process of picking my portfolio and making it, what I did is I decided to go back and look at my collection of all my sports images. They were all single images, none of them were tied in particularly to one story. The one theme that does tie them all in though to each other, actually, it's sports, so they all fall under the category of sports. And on that end, I decided to break down the sports into subcategories. Inside each sport, I also divided it into two separate kind of categories, which was portraiture and kind of action reaction moments. So I wanted to show both, that I could create a solid portraiture and then also have the ability to capture a moment. So even those kind of two separate things, it was still under the umbrella of sports. So the way I decided to start off my my portfolio was I wanted to start it off strong with greater impact, and I wanted to show that I could, you know, light well, that I know how to compose well, and that I could deal with a large group and also light them. Introduced football with a strong group portrait. Then after that, I led off with some action stuff that I did, some in-game kind of high peak action stuff, and I wanted to show that I could see light. And this was kind of a single from another game that has kind of beautiful dark moody light. And then I finished it off with the more calm image that was a portrait that I shot like in 2 minutes after a football game. Then the next sport I wanted to introduce was boxing, and I introduced that one with a portrait that I thought was strong, that had high impact. And then I went from portraiture to again action stuff, and then I kind of went for a more kind of calm, you know, editorial assignment that I had, and then from that image I went straight to kind of more of a dark moody portraiture again. Then after that, I introduced basketball again to introduce a new sport. I started off with a strong portraiture with a group portrait. Then from the team portrait, I went to action stuff, kind of high action basketball right in the middle of the air in your face, and then that's how I introduced baseball. Then I went with a more quiet, calm, you know, dark moody portrait. I finished it off with kind of 2 action shots and then a reaction shot. And then I put kind of thought into my final image, because I know you have to start strong and you want to end it strong. And I thought I started it strong with a high impact portraiture, and I wanted to end it with a nice kind of reaction shot, you know, of a young kid kind of celebrating with his hands up, kind of, you know, to symbolize that it's the end of the book. It's to kind of end it on a good mood.
The portfolio that I submitted that got me into Barnstorm 24, which was Eddie Adams 2011, it had a mix of 5 stories, 20 images long. I tried to choose a few selections from each of these stories, but all of the stories I think related. I had a through line between all the stories. And so even though there was multiple stories being represented, they were all focused on you know, portraits and then details that sort of told the story. They all sort of had an editorial feel. They all tried to be very cinematic in nature. They all try to tell the same story of my personal voice in photography, even though each of the content of each of the stories were different. I felt like that would be stronger for me than submitting 20 images on the same story. I think that if I had a story that I felt so strongly about that I could pull 20 images just to present one story, that would have even been stronger than the portfolio that I presented. But as it was, I chose 3 or 4 images. You know, the first story that I showed was some cowboys in Fargo, North Dakota that I had shot on an editorial assignment. And then there was a documentary story that I'd done as personal work about a police officer in Northern California and sort of him at work and him with his family. I showed some images from a series that I did called Harvest, which I documented some marijuana harvesters in Northern California. I showed images from a thing I did called Tent City, which was in Fresno, California. There were portraits that I made in one of these tent cities, and they had been published in Time magazine, and I had just chosen a few selections of that. But I tried to mix sort of, you know, I had a tendency when I was first doing documentary work to try to tell stories just through portraits, and I really was trying to show more details, show more overviews, really kind of try to tell the story more completely than just showing people's faces. So there was a few portraits mixed in with some details and some landscapes and some overviews. And the last photos that I showed were from a project that I did in Cambodia they're actually marketing photos for a social enterprise product called the Moonlight, which was a solar-powered lantern that they use in rural areas where they don't have access to the power grid. And the images are technical, and they, like I said, they're a little bit more marketing than pure documentary, but they're really where my interest was really moving towards, which is it's storytelling, but it also it's, you know, can be used. I've been doing a lot more storytelling for marketing purposes, and then trying to do that for social enterprises that I can really get behind. So that's the portfolio that I submitted for Barnstorm 24.
So basically, for my second portfolio, I submitted 19, and you can submit a maximum of 20 images, but I decided to submit the strongest images and 2 bodies of work that were cohesive and went together. And I think less is more when you submit, because one image could throw the whole thing off if it doesn't fit. So I started my portfolio for Eddie Adams with street photography in Venice, and then it transferred into a picture story I did on a kid that dropped out of high school and got into drugs and had a bad family environment, and it ended with that. And I think that the link between the Venice street photography and my picture story was sort of like the theme of lower class, sort of like the underbelly of America, and like how people live and survive on the streets and in poor environments. So the last image of my Eddie Adams portfolio was the subject I did my picture story on. He was sitting on the curb with his skateboard next to him with his head down.
You know, I think that we're being selected for the Eddie Adams based on our ability to tell stories. So I think that it's an opportunity in putting your portfolio together to tell a story. You know, whether it's through your image selection, through the flow of the images, through the images you choose to start and finish your portfolio, it's another opportunity to represent yourself as a storyteller, because you're crafting this edit that's a story in itself. I think it's super important to have an amazing, striking first image, and I think that it's also important to make sure that that flows into the rest of the book, and that you start. I mean, the truth is with 20 images, and they're looking at so much work, that you can't have any duds. You can't have any images that aren't amazing. You have to have 20 or less fantastic images. And I think the advice that I also got was, if you're gonna have 20 images that are like pretty good, or you're gonna have 12 images that are amazing, you should go with 12 images.
I would say sure, first if opening image can be really strong or something that gets their attention, is great, but I think that you kind of need to carry on that strength of that first image throughout the whole portfolio.
Normally the website says you can submit up to 20 images. I submitted 17 because at the time I didn't feel like I had 20 strong images, and I felt that my 17 were strong enough, and it was more important for me to make a statement of saying I knew how to edit my work and get it to 17, and say I'm not going to show you any crap. I want to show you only my best, because I don't want to like squeeze out 2 or 3 extra just because you can. You want to show them what your best work is. When it comes to portfolio reviews, you're only as good as your worst picture, and I made sure that I loved every picture individually and like together, and it was all about the strong edit that comes with it.
Advice I would give to people who haven't gotten in and are debating whether or not to submit to Eddie Adams, I would tell them to stay hungry and keep applying, because it was a great experience and I learned so much, and it was like a kick in the butt, you know, and I feel like it really showed me how much it takes to be in the industry and to pursue what you want. And if you really feel like photography is your passion, then you should just totally go for it and keep shooting and keep applying and keep getting better.
I feel I was really fortunate for not being accepted earlier, even though it took me so many years and anger to some degree, and being upset or disappointed, very disappointed multiple times. I felt after being at the Eddie Adams workshop and finally experiencing the event that I was actually really lucky for not getting in earlier, because I was able to get much more out of it from where I was at, or where I'm at with my career right now, than I would have been 5 years ago. So I actually, after all, I'm very fortunate they didn't accept me earlier.
The only other thing that I would say is that it's worth it. you know? Like, it was an amazing opportunity. It was an amazing experience. The people that I met, I'm still in touch with. The experience of getting to go out and learn from such amazing instructors. I mean, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I really do think that the Eddie Adams Workshop has done a really brilliant job of crafting a community and really giving photographers a chance to know each other, to find mentors, to learn. I mean, it's an amazing blessing. So I think even if you've applied 5 times, you got to do it a 6th time. It's well worth going. And even if photojournalism is not your end goal, whether it's, you know, directing, whether it's doing commercial work, whether it's doing fashion work, I think that what I learned was how to better communicate a story. And I think that that applies to so many different fields of photography, filmmaking, even music, anything that, you know, you're always trying to tell a story, communicate a story. And I think the Eddie Adams Workshop was such a great experience for that. I would just say it's worth it. Keep doing it. Apply again. Don't give up.